At the start of this war, it was the mighty battleships that ruled the waves, but things have changed quite a bit since then. Now the undisputed kings of the sea are the aircraft carriers, specifically those of the U.S. Navy's task forces. They've proven their abilities at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and are readying for the final invasion of Japan. But how did we get here? And how did it all happen so quickly? Let's find out. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a World War II in real-time special on the development of U.S. Navy carrier doctrine. To get to grips with this fundamental change in naval warfare, we have to go back to December 1941, when Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Their goal was to render the U.S. unable to mount any significant naval response for a considerable time, while they themselves consolidated control over portions of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. However, because carrier Saratoga was refitting at San Diego, Lexington was supplying Midway, and Enterprise's return to Pearl Harbor was delayed a day by bad weather, though its planes actually did still participate in the fight over Hawaii, a significant and increasingly important part of U.S. naval power survived to fight back. In fact, the very nature of the attack on Pearl Harbor, carriers launching aircraft to attack an enemy fleet, signaled to the world that the war in the Pacific would not be fought with giant capital ships slugging it out toe-to-toe, but rather from the decks of aircraft carriers with sleek fighters and deadly torpedo bombers. The mighty battleship, which would still prove useful for shore bombardment and surface ship engagement, had become little more than a target for such aircraft. Let's have a look at how the U.S. Navy built the mighty carrier fleet that rules the waves. Already by the late 1920s, they had built the carriers Saratoga and Lexington, which were full-sized carriers, or fleet carriers. And by December 7, 1941, the Navy had a total of 7 fleet carriers and 1 escort carrier. Only the 3 I mentioned were in the Pacific at the time. The remaining 4 were stationed in the Atlantic. But this was a foundation to strike back at the Japanese as they rampaged across the South Pacific. Key to this striking back is the development of the Carrier Task Force. Where before the battleships were used to project power, it is now the aircraft carriers and their planes which do so, with the flat tops screened by a force of cruisers, destroyers, and whatever else can be spared. Broadly speaking, the U.S. has 2 kinds of carriers in this war. The first are the large fleet carriers like Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga. These are the fastest, have the longest range, and carry the most airplanes. Then there are the smaller escort carriers like Long Island, which are roughly half the size of the fleet carriers. As their name suggests, escort carriers escort convoys, amphibious assault groups, and similar slower fleets that require air support or to help project additional air power in some area. It doesn't take the Americans long to realize that aircraft carriers now need to be built at a rate never before seen. Fleet carriers can take 2 to 3 years to build, but the smaller escort carriers can be built rapidly, and often cheaply, on top of a merchant ship hull. They pour out of places like the Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast. Of the 151 U.S. carriers built during the war, oh yes, 151. 122 of them are escort carriers. Although they can only carry like half the number of airplanes as the larger fleet carriers, the sheer volume of production makes up for their limitations in size and power. Simply put, the beauty of the escort carrier is that nimble shipyards like Kaiser can crank them out faster than the Japanese can possibly sink them. The downside, of course, is that some compromises have to be made to get them off the slipway and into combat as quickly as possible. Many of you have commented under our videos how surprised you are at the wooden decks and lack of armor on the American escort carriers as opposed to, for example, the British ones. But those compromises, along with things like less powerful engines, keep a steady flow of these vital warships streaming from the West Coast to the South Pacific. It's one of those cases where quantity has a quality all of its own. The Navy also pushed ahead with innovations in naval aviation training. Much of this is down to one man, Commander and later Vice Admiral Richard Whitehead. Whitehead rose through the ranks as an enlisted sailor before the First World War and was an aviation officer stationed in Chicago at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. Before the attack, he had proposed a new training program for carrier pilots. Central to this was his idea of acquiring a couple of Great Lakes passenger ships, turning them into training carriers, and schooling the pilots on Lake Michigan. Whitehead's idea did not really gain much traction before Pearl Harbor. But afterwards, Chief of Naval Operations Ernest King orders full steam ahead. The Navy buys a pair of side paddle wheel passenger ships and rapidly converts them and puts them into service in the summer of 1942. USS Sable and Wolverine each have flight decks around 500 feet long, 152 meters. This is much shorter than the 800-foot flight decks, 244 meters, found on combat carriers. But the challenge of the shorter deck serves those trained on them well in combat. Fun fact, some guy named George Herbert Walker Bush trains on USS Sable. He might become important someday. During the war, over 18,000 pilots train on the Great Lakes. And in the future, perhaps in reference to some sort of massively successful Hollywood production about naval aviators, some people will call them the Top Guns of 1943. As more carriers, planes, pilots, and ships and crews of all types become available, the U.S. goes on the offensive, building on the success of the June 1942 Battle of Midway, taking the war to Japan. The carriers are key to the success of the island-hopping campaign, which brings the Allies ever closer to the Japanese home islands. Without the ability to project air power at any step of the way, this tactic would have been much more difficult. While the fleet carriers ensure area command of the skies, the little escort carriers provide air support for amphibious landings and help soften local Japanese air defenses. By 1944, the U.S. unquestionably owns the skies over the Pacific, and through a combination of land and carrier-based planes can start hitting the Japanese home islands on a regular basis. But the closer the war comes to Japan, the harder it gets for U.S. forces, especially when it comes to providing aerial support for the men on the ground. Richard Whitehead will receive a Navy Distinguished Service Medal for developing new carrier tactics at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, specifically to support amphibious landings. But by now, the Navy also has to reckon with the kamikaze threat as well as from regular Japanese aircraft. Oh, a quick side note here. Steve, who is one of our Time Ghost ambassadors and often answers your comments below our videos, did the research and writing for this episode. He actually owns Whitehead's sword, along with a Panzerschreck and a mortar, and a whole bunch of firearms from this war and from others. So, anyone thinking of misbehaving in the comments, just remember, Steve has a small arsenal of weapons that he can use to deal with you. We are an Old Testament sort of channel when it comes to retaliation. Okay, back on topic. And while Japan had signaled that the age of the battleship was ending back on December 7, 1941, it is the U.S. that firmly closes that book during the Battle of Okinawa. On April 7, 1945, aircraft from Admiral Mark Mitscher's Fast Carrier Task Force sink the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, proving once and for all that any ship anywhere is at risk from destruction by carrier aircraft. Even as the battle for Okinawa rages, the final invasion of Japan looms large in everyone's minds. Both sides know it's coming, and both sides expect it to be fought with bloody fanaticism. For the U.S., that means doing everything possible to soften up the local defenses before the invasion. The force projection of the carrier fleet is set to be a key part of that plan. I've talked several times about the planned invasion of the home islands, Operation Downfall. And when it comes to carriers, the plan is for several dozen carriers and escort carriers to be involved. A carrier fleet that size and composition will mean a force of many thousands of carrier airplanes available for combat operations. While land-based bombers will continue to pummel Japanese cities and military targets, the carriers will control the skies, track surviving ships, and provide the all-important air cover for amphibious landings, establishing beachheads and the advances inland. So, where do we stand here in mid-1945, and what might we be able to see in future? In short, the ability to rapidly build and, more importantly, integrate multiple classes of carriers into combat doctrine and operations is making it possible to end the war faster and more efficiently. The island-hopping campaign would not have been possible without carrier support, and the destruction of the Japanese surface shipping would have been much harder. The carriers are also a clear statement of American power and intent. The presence of a massive carrier fleet controlling the skies over the oceans, along with the nimble little escort carriers supporting amphibious assaults, sends a clear message to America's enemies. We are here, and we are in charge. Beyond this war, the U.S. Navy already knows that these carriers and their planes will also be key in future conflicts anywhere near the sea. If you'd like to see more on the development of another arm of the U.S. military, click here for our special on the development of the United States Army Air Forces. To get ever more content like this, join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com, for it is the Army that is carrying us through this war. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.